Everybody, thanks for watching. Now, of course, it's going to be people who are going to say that the media has no influence on how people feel about African Americans. But after this video, you will see clearly that the media has portrayed a negative image of African Americans over the decades in, movies, music, television, and that this image they have cast of us, of African Americans, is the driving force behind, the fear, the racism, the prejudice, the stereotypes of African American people. Now, as bad as racism seems today, it's nothing compared to racism in the 50s and 60s. But believe it or not, from the mid 60s to the late 80s, African Americans played, a positive role throughout television. And we know about the 90s where African American TV shows basically dominated the airwaves. Now, African Americans in the mid 60s and 70s and 80s played a lot of positive roles on TV and in movies. Now, that's partly thanks to a man named Frank Stanton. Now, Frank Stanton was the president of CBS. In 1964, he gave a speech. He was a strong supporter of civil rights, of the whole civil rights movement. And he gave a speech in 1964 where he urged, presidents and, producers from movie companies and from production houses to basically support civil rights and to let that reflect, let that show in, on television and in movies and on the radio. And, a lot of the stations and networks followed his lead, and actors and musicians basically flooded the market, from then on. And we had a surge of African American actors and, movie stars and musicians in the 60s and 70s. Thanks a lot to Frank Stanton and to a lot of executives who supported civil rights and who stepped up and made that move. Now, here's a list of a bunch of shows that had either starred African Americans or co-starred African Americans or featured African Americans on television. Now, we had shows like The Jeffersons, I Spy, Good Times, The Bill Cosby Show, Sammy Davis Jr. Show, not to mention all of the movies that starred African Americans. You had shows that wasn't just, black exploitation films. We had Three the Hard Way, with Jim Brown, Jim Kelly, Fred Wilkerson, Black Caesar, Let's Do It Again with Sidney Poitier, Coffee, Foxy Brown, Gordon's War, Superfly, the list goes on. They call this the golden age of African American film and television. You had African American heroes, successful black people shown on TV and in movies. You had black and white being united while still showing, black unity and black power. This definitely was the golden age of African American film and television. And through the 60s, when you start looking at a lot of those shows, you can see that, on TV and as well as in movies, blacks was dominating in action films. We was dominating in fighting against oppression. Then, more than any other race, you didn't have, Spanish TV shows and Spanish movies that was like really promoting unity and power for their race as much as, African Americans was in the 60s and 70s. And it seemed like, everybody was on board with it. You had a lot of movies that cast, white people was mostly the bad guy in all of those movies. You had a lot of movies where you had African Americans defeating a Caucasian bad guy, or the Caucasian was the head drug dealer of the movie. He was the main bad guy, and it was always portrayed as, the white man was the bad guy and the black guy was just fighting against oppression and poverty. And, this was the theme for a lot of those shows and movies. And it really put African Americans in a positive, successful light. So when you start looking at the TV shows back then in the 60s and 70s, before we had Cops, Cops, when we watch it, it show you what's going on and, bad neighborhoods and what kind of crimes are being committed. And, in the 60s and 70s, there was no Cops. Obviously, Cops didn't come out until later, but they had Dragnet and they had Adam 12. Now, these shows basically took real events that happened and they cast them as TV shows, and they recorded these shows, and you remember at the end of the show, it always says something like, this is a true story. The names of the people was just changed to protect the innocent and stuff like that. Dragnet and Adam 12 still come on today. But when you look at those shows, you can see that predominantly almost every single episode was showing, white violence. It was showing, everything that we get blamed for today as African Americans, you can see back then and, in those TV shows. Before the crack epidemic hit, you had a serious cocaine problem in the white neighborhood. When you start watching those shows, you can see it. The main drug dealers was always Caucasian men. You can see women. I mean, in a lot of those shows, you see women who look like school teachers or moms, selling drugs and committing crimes. And this is what TV was showing back then. They wasn't in the African-American neighborhood, and it wasn't showing no kind of serious crime or no kind of, nothing to the level that they were showing white America as far as the crime level. Now, of course, there was crime in the African-American community, but it wasn't nothing like, fraud. And, on Adam 12, they show stuff like child molestation and all kinds of craziness, stuff that we see today, you were seeing back then, but exclusively in the white neighborhood. And they were showing these TV shows constantly, and you can see them. You had Highway Patrol, which was another TV show. It wasn't based off of real life, but when you watched that show all the time, it was always casting Caucasians, committing crimes, murdering people, killing old people, all kinds of crazy stuff was on the TV showing Caucasians in a negative light in the 60s and 70s. And when you go back and start looking at it, you can see that this is what the media was putting out. African Americans had shows and movies that was casting them as heroes and casting them as, freedom fighters. Meanwhile, you look at TV and all you see was, the whole airways flooded with shows about Caucasian crime, Caucasian murder, white on white crime. And this is what you can see soon as you turn on the television. I mean, Adam 12 was a big show. Everybody know Dragnet was a big show, and it was both based off of true events. So now mid 60s, 70s, you turn on the TV and all you see is Caucasians, white America being cast as the bad guy. Always showing them selling drugs or being rapists or murderers. And you start looking at African American TV shows and you see us as this hero. Now, most of the times when they show African American crimes, it was always like a consensus that anything that we did was always, promoted as, us just fighting against oppression, fighting for freedom, fighting against, the white races who was oppressing us and prejudice. And it was always promoted as black power because, after the 60s, after we lost all of our leaders and a lot of people was getting assassinated, then, it was a consensus around America that anything that we was doing basically for racial equality, for civil rights. And this was almost like a theme back then that you can see, when you start looking at Superfly and, Foxy Brown and Jim Brown and all the movies and stuff that they put out, Jim Kelly and all them, the theme was almost the same. Black man fighting against the white man who's racist or against oppression or against drugs in the community and stuff like that. And this was the theme. So we was cast almost like as the hero. And then you just keep seeing, the white man in this negative light. And if you're trying to bring down African Americans, you can't keep showing America that we are just fighting against, freedom, fighting for our freedom, or fighting against oppression and fighting for civil rights and equality. Meanwhile, all we see from the white man is drug dealer, murderer, this and that. So eventually, of course, somebody took note of that. And, you had basically in 1964, after Frank Stanton gave that speech, in 1970, you had the FCC. They passed it was called the Minority Ownership Policy. So what they did was they gave incentives, tax incentives for network owners and, people who own these stations. Whenever they sold a channel or a network, if they sold it to a minority or to a black person or whatever, then they got tax incentives. So what happened was a lot of these stations was being sold to African Americans, and it was able to, we was able to put out these kind of movies and TV shows. And, eventually that came to an end because around 1990, Congress and the FCC basically allowed for the consolidation of TV networks. So they basically said, okay, it's fine for you guys to just basically buy up as many networks as possible. before it was almost like an agreement that, you can't have a monopoly on TV, because then you'll own television. You'll basically own the minds of America. And that's basically what you see today. So in 1990, when Congress and the FCC allowed this to happen, this is where we see, all of these networks start to get bought up, and the complexion, started to change, and, the tone started to change, from the black hero to, something else. So in 1995, you had the Republican Party basically get together and banned the minority ownership policy. They got rid of it. It basically was giving incentives to owners who sold stations and networks to African Americans or to minorities, and they banned the whole thing. So you may be thinking that it wasn't, black people who had enough money to buy a network back then, but it was. It was a lot of rich African Americans who was trying to buy up networks and TV stations because they knew how important it was for us, to put out our own image and not have somebody else, putting out the image of us and portraying us the way they see us, as it is today. So the whole thing is, if you start going back, the last 30 years, you have a lawsuit against the FCC, for discrimination or civil rights reasons. Every year for the last 30 years, there has been multiple lawsuits against the FCC for, discrimination, for, civil rights reasons. We know Byron Allen, he just sued Comcast and Time Warner, and he was claiming, he was trying to get $20 billion. They threw that shit out, of course. But he, in his 70-page lawsuit, I read most of it, and, he was telling the truth. He had all these production companies. Well, he still have all these production companies, and Time Warner and Comcast would not give him no spot. They wouldn't give him nothing. And, you start to pick up on that. Well, what's the problem? You give Al Sharpton, who he also named in the lawsuit, you give Al Sharpton these spots and this and that, and I got all these production companies, I'm doing well, and they're not giving him anything. So he tried to sue for, $20 billion. They threw the case out, whatever like that. But, I'm not no big Byron Allen supporter. The man worth about $200-300 million. I haven't really seen him do anything for African Americans at all. But he did make a lot of good points in his lawsuit, and he was basically talking about how the image of African Americans is being controlled and how they portray us any way they want to portray us. And, it's all about gangster rap, and it's about us looking negative and not having the kind of shows that, show us in a more positive light like we used to. Now, in 1983, you had about, 50 different companies that owned, 90% of the news stations or TV stations and TV networks in America. And of course, that number got, dwindled down to just 6. They call them the big 6. You got Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation. You got Comcast. You got Time Warner. You got Disney, and you got CBS. And they basically own every single TV station and network in America. They run it all. Now, the whole thing is, if you manage to get a TV station, because you have to understand, the TV station and the network is separate. Now, you got to get a TV station first. Once you get a TV station, you can try to broadcast that, where you can get in where you fit in, but you still need a network to broadcast it. So if you don't own the network, then you are basically at the mercy of the network. So if you got a channel, then, a channel is just a channel. You can have good content. You can put stuff out. Look at YouTube. We got YouTube. You're on my channel. Without YouTube, then, there is no Merkabah. There's no channel. I have nothing to put out. I can't, I can, create a website and hopefully generate traffic. But when you have a network or, a company like Google who owns YouTube, and they can put this content out and, broadcast it to the masses and promote it, and so many people can come and check out your channel and everything like that. Now, that's a major thing. So basically, without Google, without YouTube, I couldn't really get these videos out to the masses of people. It's the same thing with TV. Without CBS, without Time Warner, without Disney, all of these stations that air on these networks wouldn't be able to, broadcast. So it is very important to own a network. Now, when you have 6 companies that control all the networks, you are at their mercy. And this is a huge problem. And this is something that has to, it has to change, especially for us African Americans, if we want to be looked at in a better light, or looked at, our image needs to be updated. I mean, you see how we are being portrayed. It's crazy. You look at Revolt TV.